Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this video installation of my blog. I'm Marti Fischer, and I thought this would be a very appropriate topic for this month. The topic is having difficult conversations. And we have a wonderful guest here today that we will introduce in a second. But having difficult conversations, any of you who are in leadership positions of work know that this is part of the fabric of working. Typically, conflicts at work that require difficult conversations may be about individual performance, organizational performance, compliance issues, or employee agreements, just to name a few. But this year, conflicts at work and having difficult conversations are estimated to even be more frequent due to, among other things, our upcoming election, geopolitical unrest, and continued realities of climate change. There's a lot happening in the world that we have to respond to every day. But one thing is for certain, that if you are working at some point, you will be on one side or another of a difficult conversation. That is inevitable. So to help destigmatize and provide some structure for having difficult conversations this month, we are thrilled to be joined by Chris Daly, an attorney, a state-certified trainer, mediator, conflict coach, and circle keeper with the New York Peace Institute. Chris will share her wisdom and experience on this important topic. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you so much, Marty. I'm happy to be here talking about this important topic and speaking to all of you.
I think you are going to get a vast number of people watching this recording. Let's just jump right in because time is precious for all of us and start off with the big question, elephant in the room. How can we destigmatize the inevitability of difficult conversations in the workplace?
Yeah, I think that that is the big question. I think that word that I heard you just say, I immediately want to latch onto is destigmatize. Is that, for most of us, work is so important to us. It defines who we are in our society. It's how we pay the mortgage, how we pay the rent. So it's a big part of our day and most of our day. And, most of us wake up and we want to have a good day. We don't want to have a day that's filled with stress or challenge. And so a lot of times we tend to avoid conflict. That's what we do. And so that term destigmatizing it just immediately caught my attention because we don't always get along and we don't always choose the people that we're working with, projects that we're working on, the, reports that we have to do, what we need to do to get through that day. And so I guess what my immediate reaction is to your question is just normalizing it. Normalizing the fact that conflict is normal. It happens, especially when we're working with other people, because when we work, what we're generally doing is we're creating something, we're producing something. And when you create or produce something, you don't always agree. You're not always aligned. And not knowing if you're aligned with the people that you're working with, or, frankly, just full on disagreeing can lead to conflict. And a lot of us haven't been taught as to, what should I do if I have a different vision for this than you have? Or frankly, you're speaking to me in a way that I don't appreciate when I'm just trying to get through the day.
I think you bring up great points about misalignment. Because we all have our experience, we all have our frame that we come to the workplace with, and that's how we are going to be projecting our ideas and projecting the thoughts that we have. But I would imagine, and from what I've heard from my clients, that there are some really ascendant areas where difficult conversations tend to happen most frequently. Can you talk a little bit about what you're seeing recently this year that might provide a trend for some of our leaders out there?
Sure. And so, with my work with New York Peace Institute, what we do is we do help a lot of workplaces with employee conflict. And this goes across the span. So anywhere from small organizations to large, nonprofits, for-profits, we're seeing a lot of conflicts coming up that really, I guess the first thing I'll say, that really kind of spring out of this unusual past 4 years that we've had. right? I mean, it's 2024 right now, we're wrapping it up, and it's been 4 years or 5 years since our worlds have really radically shifted with the pandemic and with the way that we do work and the way that we perceive work. So a lot of the conflicts that, we're helping with conflict coaching, with mediation, with doing group facilitated conversations and things of that nature revolve around the idea of how can we best do work? How can we be together, and how should we be together? And that takes on a couple of different flashpoints for us. There is that whole debate of remote work versus in-person work versus hybrid work. And, depending upon if you have the ability to work remotely or if you have to be in a certain place producing something, there are a lot of different factors that come up in those conversations. There are also naturally, generational issues that have been coming up with, the younger generation, Gen Z, really coming into the workforce, being digital natives, being used to doing this sort of thing that we're doing right now, right? This video conference, which frankly, 4 years ago, I don't think either one of us would have felt as comfortable doing, where we can be in totally separate locations, maybe separate, geography, separated by hundreds or thousands of miles, but we can work together. We can have conversations together. And so there's a question of, not just digital literacy, but, when do we do this work? Is it a 9 to 5 schedule? Is it something where we're sharing space? Are we working in a place where we've taken down walls and we have more of a shared office where you reserve a desk, or, you have cubicles where those walls have been removed? It's more and more that we have these, different situations where people are working at different hours in different locations at different times and producing product, but we might not always have the same alignment as to how that gets produced and how we share feedback with each other.
Which is a great point, because for the first time, and maybe the last time, we really have 4 generations working in the workplace at the same time. And so there are many different lenses and many different ways of thinking about how we work that are all brought to the table every day in a working situation. So you had mentioned that you work with teams, you work with groups, sometimes you work one-on-one with a leader and someone who they're having some friction with. Is there a process that you follow that can introduce and have a difficult conversation that will eventually, and we'll get to outcome a little bit later, but how do you follow the process for introducing and having this kind of difficult conversation?
Yeah, no, really important question, because I think what most people automatically do when they think about there might be a conflict at work, there's a disagreement, there was a situation or awkward conversation, they tend to avoid, right? When there's something that doesn't feel good, we tend to go away from that. And that's the opposite of what needs to happen, in my experience, in these types of conversations, is we need to figure out, okay, let's not ignore the fact that there are conflict, but let's think about how we're going to plan to have a conversation that meets the needs of the employees or the people who are part of stakeholders in this conversation. So the first thing I'd say here is that prep is key, right? You have to not avoid, but you have to think before you set up a meeting or before you set up a process, what do I want to get out of this, right? What is my goal? What am I trying to communicate here? And how do I feel about it? And how can I communicate this so that I can get what I want, right? You shouldn't go in blind. Like, these are things that you should think about, and it's very important that you do that not only for yourself, but that you engage in something that mediators use after learning how they do this, through practice, which is doing some mental role reversal too, which is thinking, what does this person who I want to speak with, what are they looking to get out of this conversation? How are they feeling about it? And, how are they going to strategize to get what they want? So you have to do this sort of mental prep before you go into these conversations. And that is very counterintuitive, because, the human mind tends to want to avoid that. And when you do that, you come out with all kinds of unintended impacts and unintended outcomes. And so to get the impact and the outcome that you want, you really have to do that prep.
Which I think is so critical. And it's something that We also hear this with something like public speaking, right? People don't like to speak in public, but they also don't want to prepare for it when they have to. There's a lot of approach avoidance here, and with a focus more on avoidance. But if you put the time in for that preparation and really start to exercise the empathy muscle and understand where your other party might be coming from, and then finally what we want to get from that, all of that preparation, I completely agree, will be so valuable. Sometimes we don't have the opportunity to prepare. Mm-hmm. And if there is a difficult conversation that needs to happen in the moment, is there any advice that you can offer for that scenario?
Yeah. I mean, slow it down. That's my first advice. Slow it down, because when we come into a conversation where all of a sudden we feel challenged and put on the spot, what that does is it does something very real in our brains where, it is a fight, flight, or freeze response frequently where, you do feel threatened and, you're wondering, why is this person not on the same page with me? Why don't they agree with me? And your first instinct is probably to, strongly say something that, you believe to be true without really considering their perspective. If that's going into sort of a fight response, the flight response is you just shut down and you leave, right? Or you don't say anything. And both of those aren't going to serve your purposes in the workplace because, it's really hard to remember that not everyone is like yourself. They haven't had the same journey. They haven't had the same experiences. They might not hold the same goals for their job or their role in the workplace. And they might, frankly, just be having a bad day. We don't know everything about other people. So there's something about that humility that we have to bring into a situation when all of a sudden we can become hypercharged by feeling threatened. So that's why I say slow it down. Your first response is probably not going to be your best response.
That is amazing advice, because when people do run towards something, that's exactly what they're doing, is running toward it, as opposed to we should walk slowly toward this and thoughtfully toward this. But it brings up really the crux of what everyone is thinking about when it comes to a difficult conversation, which is emotion. Mm-hmm. These kinds of conversations are often emotionally charged. So what is your advice for incorporating, acknowledging, and managing emotional response?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is a question that is oftentimes coded as like a softball question or a soft topic, which kind of like brings up the ire in me, because when you start learning about this field, you realize that emotions motivate behavior. Emotions cause behavior. And so oftentimes when we're at work, we think, we're professional, right? We're analytical. We're making serious decisions based upon the serious work that we're doing. This is not a space for intimacy per se. But that being said, we're humans. We're not computers, right? We're not artificial intelligence. And, if you look into this, the reason why we do things is oftentimes motivated by emotions. And so just building your emotional intelligence, building your capacity for, as you said, empathy, understanding what you're truly feeling, what's motivating you is the first step before you can start thinking, what's the zone of this other person? What does it seem like they're feeling? Let's not ignore that. What is it that we're perceiving here? So, some of this work is really like a back to basics type work where, you have to think to yourself, we might be having a conversation that's really highly coded, particular jargon for this project that you're working on. But what is the elemental conflict that is all of a sudden causing some friction here? It might be something as basic as, I feel like you've taken my idea, or I feel like you're not respecting my opinion based on the experience that I have. That stuff is real and it goes deep. And so my advice here is really, to be in touch with your own emotional intelligence and build that up before you start thinking, what's going on with this other person, and realizing there might be a mismatch there. And again, that's where taking a break, having time to process sometimes can really help.
Mm-hmm. Without a doubt. And what I love about that piece is that sometimes as leaders, we feel like we have to come in at this higher level where we don't acknowledge our emotions, how we're coming to this, how someone else might be coming to this, but we try to move through step-by-step checklist process, and that's not how the human brain responds well. So the fact that you're coming back to this, let's get down to what the issue really is. Are we stuck in a tactic? Is there something way more elemental than that? As in, did you take my idea? Are you not respecting what I'm saying? And then using that as the starting point, by getting back, peeling back the onion of the symptoms to get to what that core issue is. So thank you for that. And part of this, and I'm sure you see this a lot when you're doing this work, especially on Zoom, is nonverbal communication. Is there any sort of nonverbal communication that, to get into a productive place, should be incorporated? I'll also ask the flip side, is there anything that should be avoided? But let's start with incorporated.
I love that question because it does make an impact, and they say, and I've seen so many different proportions of what's communicated non-verbally versus actually verbally in your words. And I don't want to say it's like 30%, 40%, 50%. I've seen different quantifications of that, but the non-verbal cues are loud when we are in conversation with each other. And so, doing this type of work where we're behind a screen, there are certain tips where you can look at the camera, you can be square on, you can, do your nonverbal attenders, like you're nodding, you're gesticulating if that's natural for you. Of course, that's all going to foster more of a connection than, looking down, typing, doing an email, right? Looking off, having a fan behind you. All of those things can, indicate disinterest or perhaps disrespect, but it's also cultural. It's cultural. There are different cultural considerations as to how people communicate, and I can't give you a panacea as to how it goes across all cultures, but what you should know is that it's important. People are perceiving creatures. We judge our environments, and whether it's through a Zoom or whether it's across the table and one person's at the head and the other person's relegated to the side, these types of power plays matter. So pay attention to them, but realize that, sometimes people are inadvertent about it and they're not picking up on it. So, I always say, try to be transparent and try to show openness and, of course, authenticity to working on a project together, if that's what you're doing, but acknowledging what's impacting you and doing maybe some debriefing about it with colleagues.
And I think that also gets back to your earlier point about preparation. Mm-hmm. If you are doing this in an office, if you are doing this in a boardroom, being very mindful of where you're sitting, where they're sitting, so that you're not sending a nonverbal communication that you don't want to send. So
yeah, I mean, who doesn't love a round table? I mean, we all love that. But
when was the last time you saw a round table in a boardroom?
Yeah,
never.
There needs to be a sea change with that, because the point is if we're working on a team, right, Marty, and we're working with colleagues, like not doing a negotiation with someone from a different side, but if we're on the same team, we're working together, and we need to acknowledge that we're bringing different parts of our experience and our knowledge in our roles to the table. So let's be teammates, and let's hear if someone's perceiving this differently than me. That's useful information. Mm-hmm. Conflict transformers, mediators, conflict coaches, the work that we do here at New York Peace Institute, we want to hear those different perceptions because they make us stronger as not only communicators, but also in working on whatever it is for the goal of our project, knowing that perhaps we're missing something. Let's know what that is.
Yeah. We've spent this part of the conversation talking about the person who will be the lead on this difficult conversation, someone who's going to bring this to the fore. Let's change gears for a minute and talk about the recipient, because to your point about planning, if you can start to acculturalize some of these norms in the workplace, it can be very helpful when the eventuality of a difficult conversation comes up for the recipient of that information to have a sense of what's expected, how to act, and the role that they're going to play here and what the guardrails are. So let's talk for a minute about the recipient.
Yeah, and the recipient is equally important in this conversation. I mean, it takes two to tango. It's like a tennis match. You can't, volley, you can't have a serve and then expect it to be volleyed back without the other person. So I really think, and again, this sounds simple, but I want to go back to the basics on this. You have to humanize and think about the other person as a truly, realized human being. And the fact that they might have more at risk in this conversation than you, if you're the executive or the leader. They might have more fear, right? More anxiety about losing some part of their role or losing some part of their status in the job, or frankly, losing money if they're up for a promotion or something that they've done is very, very serious. So the stakes of the other side might be radically different than your stakes. This might be just a regular pro forma conversation for you. And for them, they couldn't sleep the night before because they're so worried. And so, it's really important as a human being that you first of all, remember your whole story, remember how you got to where you are, and, and take a beat and realize that this other person, a human who's probably trying to get through the day and do the best that they can. And if they're not, then why not? Why aren't they being supported so that they can do the work that they're truly capable of at the job? Maybe there are barriers there that haven't been mentioned. And maybe it's because of some of these power structures that come up in work where they don't want to raise the issue because they're afraid of being penalized, or they're afraid of appearing, not as smart or not as capable. And that's a real barrier to everyone doing their best job. Mm-hmm. So I do think, again, that prep matters, but also realizing that the stakes are higher perhaps on the other side.
And so what I'm hearing here is that before a difficult conversation ever needs to happen, to do some work for leaders to think about how can we create workplaces where there's 99 times out of 100 going to be a power structure because there is a hierarchy in the workplace. But how do we create an environment where people are heard, and that even under stressful situations, tension-filled situations, they are still free to ask questions, explain how they're coming to a specific place, how they're coming to a specific conversation, to create the context for that conversation to be more productive. So there is pre-work, I think, what you're saying here, that we can do as leaders, as teams, so that when these conversations come up, both parties have a good sense of what their role is in that conversation.
Yes. And I think that one of the key characteristics that's often missed with this type of dynamic is having both sides lean into a bit of curiosity as to why this conflict has happened, and just really listening to why this has happened. Why is this the policy? Why is this the ask? Why is this the pushback? Why is this impossible? And only then will you get to, perhaps creating a better outcome, because you've gotten to the source of that tension. Without being curious as to why this happens, oftentimes it's just a demand. You need to do it this way. You need to speak this way. You need to perform this role, and sometimes leaders are rigid. They don't want to be questioned, and they can feel defensive. And I would caution, leaders from that human reaction, and just say, a true leader is someone who feels confident, exploring protocol and revisiting protocol so that, we can have best practices, that we can move forward.
Mm-hmm. And I think being open to that why. Things change over time. We don't act the same way now that we acted as organizations during the pandemic. We were in crisis mode. Now we're not in crisis mode. What changed? Some things are vestiges and stayed. Maybe they don't even need to continue. So that continuous questioning only makes us stronger as an organization. Now that we've had this conversation, let's talk about how to make it productive, because you got to the issue. You've talked about it. Now what happens in order for this to have an outcome that, to go back to the beginning of our conversation, can destigmatize this whole process, or start to destigmatize this whole process?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that, the conversation is productive when the parameters of it were established to have that safe sharing of perspectives so that you can get down from what are frequently positional statements, whereas you must do this, this is what has to happen, to, again, the why this has to happen. Because when you get into the whys, what you're doing is you're tethering those back probably to your goals and to your objectives, not just for your role in the workplace, but also for the entity's objective. Like, why does this workplace exist? What is your purpose? And so, to have productive conversations where there was disagreement, it's, let's go back. Why are we all working here? What's our goal? What are we trying to do? What are we trying to achieve? And you know what? There are probably a bunch of different pathways to achieve that goal. And so by having these conversations where you don't run away from difference, but you say, you know what, we are having a difference here, let's explore that. You're ultimately going to discover, you know what, it's this one superhighway that we've been traveling, but maybe there's another one that's, parallel to it, and we can do this a different way or even create a new road forward. Mm-hmm. So what I'm trying to say here is that, by unearthing those different perspectives and experiences, you're ultimately richer for it. Because it doesn't mean everyone's agreeing if there's no conflict. It means you're missing data. You're losing out on some information that ultimately would make you and your role stronger and the workplace stronger if you haven't explored it.
I think your point about you're missing data is such an amazing nugget for people, because we tend to come to a conversation with a difficult conversation. This is what I see is an issue, a point of tension, wrong, pick whatever descriptor you want to pick, as opposed to data mining. Let's try to find more data. If there's conflict, if there's disagreement, let's figure out really what the genesis of that was and how we need to move forward with that. Do you work with clients in terms of developing a follow-up plan for after you've come in and had a difficult conversation? And what does that look like?
Yeah, I think that, if you want to provide value to clients, what you have to do is you do have to do that hard work when you're facilitating the dialogue of identifying where do you want to go and how do you want to get there? And a lot of times that's pragmatic work that, again, can be tinged with fear and anxiety, because oftentimes people aren't always, free or at liberty to say those things. So what we like to do at NYPI is we like to say, let's remove all the barriers. Let's pretend you have a magic wand, and if you're able to do anything here, what would it be? And if you could get there in any way, how could you do it? And it sounds a bit fantastical at the start, and so we have to really encourage our clients to walk through that exercise. But when we brainstorm without barriers, what we often find is, out of those 20 ideas that might seem fantastical at the start, there's 2 or 3 nuggets of wisdom that can actually be converted to something real. Or we can get to the origin of why is this so appealing? How can we replicate that in reality? So I think it's, we all live in a world where, there's gravity, things fall when you let go of them. But, there's something creative to the process of saying, what would happen if we could change this? And that's ultimately empowering. And it's the way to break down, the steps and figuring out what's important to these people, what's important to the company, and how are you going to get there, and taking the time to come up with some action steps. And then I guess lastly, looping back a couple weeks later or a couple months later for some accountability, because we all know the world keeps going, it keeps spinning, and the next fire comes up. And so, who amongst us doesn't need a little bit of a check-in to say, how are you doing with those goals? Do we need to modify them? Are they still realistic?
Absolutely. Yes. Follow-up and accountability, everything. But the idea of turning this moment into an ideation and a brainstorming session is a really nice way of framing full circle on something that may start as a difficult process, but actually end in a better place. Are there any indicators, if you're a leader, that maybe someone like you, a conflict coach or a professional mediator, may be needed in that scenario?
Yeah. So again, look, there are some times where you just can't have this conversation with, with your direct reports, or, it's not appropriate. And a lot of times, those conversations come up where it's too hot, right? The emotions are too high. You need more time to process information. And, humans, they have a tough time communicating what's important to them. And so, there are many times where it can be very helpful to bring in a trained facilitator for that conversation, whose duty and job is to facilitate the communication here. It's not to provide their own perspective and their own opinion. That's a big part of what we do at NYPI Institute. We take ourselves and our opinions out of it, and we really try to hear and amplify what's being said on this side and hear and amplify what's being heard on that side. We identify some commonalities, we identify some differences, and we really try to bridge that communication in a way where, I don't want to say we're wordsmithing, but we're saying, like, it sounds like you're really at loggerheads or don't agree on this concept. Is it worthwhile deconstruct that and talk about that more? Or frankly, do you want to devote your time to this other thing? Because when you don't have that neutral person in there who's impartial, you know what? You get tied to a position that's super important to you emotionally or values wise, and you might be spending all this time on something that frankly isn't the real topic at hand. If you bring in a neutral facilitator, they should be able to go through those weeds with you, identify the topics that really need to be discussed, and if there's a way to bridge the difference.
Which goes beautifully back into the New York Peace Institute mission of let us get in the middle. Exactly what that looks like. I just want to wrap up what has been a fascinating conversation with so many beautiful pieces of advice and nuggets of information, and I know for me personally, some aha moments. But have we missed anything here that you would like to just use as a wrap up to our conversation?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I love this question. It's going to be a little bit meta, because what I'm going to say relates to it is I always like to ask that question, what have we missed? That's a question that we like to ask. And whether it's at the time of the difficult conversation, or frankly, even better to do it a second time in a debrief, I would encourage your listeners or your viewers here to, take the time to be reflective. So often in life, we just keep moving. We go down that checklist of the next thing we have to do, and we don't think back upon a conversation that we've had or a conflict that we've had and think, you know what, how would I have that conversation differently? Would I have said anything differently? What was successful in what I did say? What was missing? It's doing that sort of, Monday morning sort of, look back and really thinking, you know what, if I had to do it over again, what would I do? I would say, don't run away from that. Build time into your schedule to reflect, to debrief with your trusted colleagues, and to figure out, what's the best plan forward, because none of us are perfect, and we all become better by doing that.
Thank you. I could not have anticipated a better wrap up to this wonderful conversation. Chris Daly, thank you so much for your time. I am confident that the people that see this are going to learn a lot from it and help us as we navigate from now to the end of the year and beyond. So thank you so much for your time and for joining us today.
Thank you, Marty, for the opportunity and for your good work.